Hi, my name's Chris. This is Ryan, that's Taylor, and that's Michaela. And today we'll be talking to you about China. So is China a good market for Larry Zier's DIR product? To understand that, we're going to look at three main things. The global economic environment, any legal and political risks associated with China, and lastly, the culture. But first, we're going to start with the economic environment. Ever since 1978, China is a socialist market economy. Even though they're a socialist market economy, they're not purely socialist, as they're influenced by a lot of capitalism, which is what they attribute to their large growth in GDP. Out of all 178 ranked economies in the nation, or in the world, China is 137th out of 178 for freest economy. That means they're very repressed. Even though that means they're repressed, doesn't mean that it's a bad economy for us to go into, because their trade freedom has improved by 50 points over the last 20 years, and right now is sitting at the current world average. China has roughly a $9 trillion GDP. But they have 1.4 billion people that live there. So even though it might seem like a high-income developed country, it isn't yet. Its GDP per capita is roughly 6,800. So that puts it right in line for your upper middle income countries. What that means is you have industrialization, you have urbanization, and you have this big focus on advancing education. I said China's not developed yet, but they're a developing country. Or to be a developed country, you would have to have both a high GDP per capita and a high GNI per capita. But the reason China's still developing is, as we saw, their GDP is fairly low, but their GNI per capita is also low as well, only at roughly $6,600. Now, over the last, I would say about 14 years, China's seen a decent amount of growth, particularly from 2000 to 2010. 2013, their GDP growth was only 7.7%. Compared to 2010, when it was 10.4, and compared to the average from 2000 to 2009 at 9.4, we're decreasing. And that decrease is going to continue because we forecasted that by 2016, it'll be at 7.4%. So why do we want to go into this Chinese market? Great question. 2013 FDI, their foreign direct investments were at $350 trillion. That's the highest it's ever been. The only time you've come close to that is in 2011, when it was at $337 trillion. So what does this mean? A lot of foreign companies have a lot of confidence in the Chinese market, and it must be easy for them to get into it because they're spending so much money, investing so much money there. Our product is particularly going to target the service sector. The service sector right now is at 52 mean PMI from 2013 to year-to-date 2014. What's PMI? PMI is your Purchasing Manager Index. This measures if a sector is currently expanding or retracting. If it's over 50, it's expanding, and China's is 52. So this is an expanding sector with a high FDI, and the GDP is still fairly stable, which makes this a very good opportunity for us to penetrate. With that said, we'll turn over to Taylor, who's going to discuss the legal and political risks.
Thanks, Chris. So while the economic environment of China might be attractive to Larry Zier's DIR for-time product, there could still be some political and legal risks for this type of model. First off, China is majorly ruled by the Communist Party of China, which was founded in 1921. Since then, this party has grown to be a membership population of 86.7 million people, which is the largest political party in the world. The Communist Party of China governs the majority of the activities and resources found in China, and that said, this could pose a serious threat to Larry's full-time therapy model, if the Communist Party decides to rule out this type of activity in China. A legal risk in China is that they still have in effect the one-child policy law, which is in effect of 35.9% of China's population. So, with that being said, one child is legal in some parts, 35.9% of China. So that could be a risk for Larry Zier's floor-time model because only one child is legal in some parts of China. Now I'll pass it over to Michaela, who's going to talk about high versus low context and business ethics and etiquette.
So China is a high context culture, which means that information is received in the context of communication rather than the verbal message itself. In a high context society, there's a great emphasis on a person's values and their place in society, and their word is their bond. So your actual word is more important than a written contract, which is definitely important to consider. And with all of this in mind, in China, jobs are given to people who can be trusted. So this places high importance on relationships. And before you can have a business relationship, you really need to form a personal relationship. Another important aspect of a high context culture is polychronic time, which means that everything is dealt with in terms of its own time. So although business meetings may start exactly at a certain time, they may extend to hours past or days past what they had already planned because they're really focused on cultivating that relationship and getting to know their business partners well. Another important aspect of high context culture is seniority, as well as face, which is the idea of someone's reputation or the respect that they've gained. And you can attain face by showing up to meetings or bringing gifts or even just showing respect for the Chinese culture. So these are definitely all important aspects to consider when bringing the Larry Zier and Associates to China. So I've also found some basic business etiquette rules that should be followed in China. And as I've said, personal relationships are essential. So although we may initially want to train therapists in China, we need to make sure that we're cultivating those relationships and making sure that they are extended to long-term relationships and there's open communication there. It's also important when you meet someone in China that you shake hands and slightly nod your head. But don't shake hands too vigorously because it might seem offensive to them. It's also important when you meet someone that you address them by their title to show your respect for them. Also, when you meet someone, you will typically receive their business card, and when you do, it's important that you receive it with both hands. In China, receiving or giving a gift with both hands shows respect and value. So when you do this, it's important to show your business partner that you really care about them and their face. And then it's also important in business meetings in China that you don't say no. In China, business leaders often tend not to say no because they want to keep that relationship open with you, and they really don't want to shut the door on it, and they want to keep it open for more ideas and opinions. And as I've said, relationships are most important, I believe, for Larry Zier, just to cultivate that and make sure that they extend to long-term relationships. So with that, I'm going to be passing it on to Ryan, and he's going to be talking about the Hofstede dimensions.
Yeah, so I'll talk about the 6 Hofstede dimensions now and how they affect the culture of China related to the United States. The first one, and one of the 3 we're going to focus on, is the power distance. Power distance is the extent that less powerful members of an organization accept the unequal distribution of authority. Easier way to say this is you stay in your rank. You know who's above you, know who's below you, and you report to them very precisely. In terms of moving floor time into China, we don't want to overjump who we know, and we want to be very respectful of their rankings. Secondly, we have individualism. As you can see, China's at a 20, while the United States is at 91, so complete opposite sides of the spectrum. Individualism is a degree of interdependency society maintains among its members, or an easier way to conceptualize this would be it's not the grades you make, it's the hands you shake. So it's not only about what you know or what you've done, but it's about who you know. If they're a family member or close family friend, or you have some kind of tie, you're much more likely to get a job than someone who might be more qualified. In our regards, we want to be very careful about what group we associate with, and we want to grow relationships within these small amount of groups so that we can build trust in the Chinese community. Masculinity is almost identical to the United States, so it's not something we need to think about separately because we're in China. Additionally, uncertainty avoidance is very similar there. They're slightly more restrained, but not something that's very important to our project. And then the third key feature we want to key in on is pragmatism. Pragmatism is how a society maintains its links to its past while moving forward and focusing on the present day. China used to focus on their past a bit too often, but that has trended in the opposite direction, and they now focus on their future and present as much as their past. A good word to sum this up would be adaptable. If we bring in a methodology that is better than what's already currently in place, they will accept it and they will adapt to it. And then lastly, we have indulgence. They are a lot more restrained in China, but we don't think this will be important to us because we're not a luxury good. We're more an essential service if you need us. Now we'll conclude.
So China seems like a pretty attractive market, right? You saw their FDI at $350 trillion, and their service sector is going to continue to expand, at least for the next couple of years. So how do we penetrate this market and become successful? Well, we have to take the several key things that we discussed today into account to make sure we're successful. First, looking at the legal and political risks to make sure that we understand these barriers and set ourselves up for success by finding ways to overcome them or at least control those risks. From Michaela's standpoint, we looked at how China is a high context culture, so we need to make sure that our messaging and the way that we deliver our product to our end consumer embodies that high context culture that China has. And lastly, as Ryan noted, China is very different from the United States, particularly they're more collective than we are. There's a higher power distance, and they're very big forward thinkers. So we have to take all of that into account when developing our product and our messaging to make sure all that falls in line with how their culture is run. If we do all of that, we believe that China is a very, very good market for us to penetrate with this DIR floor time product. And now we'll open up the floor to any questions you guys may have.